Who are the so-called Facebook fact-checkers? Well, turns out they're nothing more than propagandists who are being funded in many cases by the very people that are being fact-checked by journalists. What do I mean by that? How about this name, Bill Gates? Turns out he has a web of influence and financial backing of these so-called fact-checking organizations, which, as it turns out, according to the Columbia Journalism Review, have been whitewashing his history. I'm Ben Swann, and this is Truth in Media. Hey guys, welcome to the show, and today we're taking a look at these so-called Facebook fact-checkers. Who are they, in fact, and who do they work for? Because as you have probably seen on social media as of late, and if you follow me, you've definitely seen this, so-called fact-checkers are essentially blocking stories from being shared or even viewed by the public. Stories that in many cases talk about the coronavirus or are critical of either the national response of Dr. Anthony Fauci or of Bill Gates himself. Well, now it turns out new reporting by the Columbia Journalism Review is beginning to shed light on how much money Bill Gates has put into these organizations, and in many cases it appears to do nothing more than whitewash his own history. As recently as just this week, I released an interview that I did with Mickey Willis, the director of Plandemic 2, in which we talked specifically about the Gates Foundation and vaccines in India that reportedly left hundreds of thousands of girls sterile, as well as polio vaccines on the continent of Africa that reportedly injured thousands of children. How did Facebook fact-checkers respond? Well, they essentially blocked the story from being seen by essentially saying that the story itself was false, and then fact-checked it using some article about Lysol, which has nothing to do with the story that we talked about. But see, with Facebook and Instagram, there's no appeals process. We can't actually challenge the fact-checkers. So who's behind all of this? Before we get to that, a shout out to our sponsor for this episode, ise.media. There we are creating a platform for content creators who are being removed from other forms of media and certainly from social media sites like Facebook and YouTube. And we're running a crowdfunding campaign right now in order to raise the money to build this network out. You can actually be an equity owner, an investor in the company. Check us out today, ise.media. So how much influence does Bill Gates actually have over these so-called fact-checking organizations? Well, it turns out that Gates himself has spent hundreds of millions of dollars in order to completely control the narrative from those organizations. From the Columbia Journalism Review just recently, quote, "I recently examined nearly 20,000 charitable grants the Gates Foundation had made through the end of June and found more than $250 million going toward journalism. Recipients included news operations like the BBC, NBC, Al Jazeera, ProPublica, National Journal, The Guardian, Univision, Medium, The Financial Times, The Atlantic, The Texas Tribune, Gannett, Washington Monthly, Le Monde, and the Center for Investigative Reporting. Charitable organizations affiliated with news outlets like BBC Media Action and the New York Times Neediest Cases Fund, media companies such as Participant, whose documentary Waiting for Superman supports Gates' agenda for charter schools, journalistic organizations such as the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, the National Press Foundation, and the International Center for Journalists, and a variety of other groups creating news content or working on journalism, such as the Leo Burnett Company, an ad agency that Gates commissioned to create a news site to promote the success of aid groups. In some cases, recipients say they distributed part of the funding as subgrants to other journalistic organizations, which makes it difficult to see the full picture of Gates' funding into the Fourth Estate. What's most interesting about this Columbia Journalism Review story, though, is how Bill Gates has actually altered the journalism landscape over the last 20 years. Again, from the article, 20 years ago, journalists scrutinized Bill Gates' initial foray into philanthropy as a vehicle to enrich his software company, or a PR exercise to salvage his battered reputation following Microsoft's bruising antitrust battle with the Department of Justice. Today, the foundation is most often the subject of soft profiles and glowing editorials describing its good works. During the pandemic, news outlets have widely looked to Bill Gates as a public health expert on COVID, even though Gates has no medical training and is not a public official. PolitiFact and USA Today, run by the Poynter Institute and Gannett respectively, both of which have received funds from the Gates Foundation, have even used their fact-checking platforms to defend Gates from, quote, false conspiracy theories and, quote, misinformation. like the idea that the foundation has financial investments in companies developing COVID vaccines and therapies. In fact, the foundation's website and most recent tax forms clearly show investments in such companies, including Gilead and CureVac. And so in short, what we see happening here is the Gates Foundation has funded massive media operations, not individual newspapers and sites, but large ownership groups, provided them with large amounts of money, and then those grants are then distributed out to even smaller groups by those larger journalistic sites. The problem is that in doing so, Gates seems to have been able to whitewash his own reputation and avoids criticism going forward. 5 years ago, in 2010, CJR published a two-part series that examined in part the millions of dollars going toward PBS NewsHour, which it found to reliably avoid critical reporting on Gates. In 2011, the Seattle Times detailed concerns over the ways in which the Gates Foundation funding might hamper independent reporting. 2 years after the story appeared, the Seattle Times accepted substantial funding from the Gates Foundation for an education reporting project. These stories offered compelling evidence of Gates' editorial influence, but they didn't attempt to investigate the full scope of the foundation's financial reach into the Fourth Estate. For perspective, $250 million is the same amount that Jeff Bezos paid for the Washington Post. When Gates gives money to newsrooms, it restricts how the money is used, often for topics like global health and education, on which the foundation works, which can help elevate its agenda in the news media. For example, in 2015, Gates gave $383,000 to the Poynter Institute, a widely cited authority on journalism ethics and an occasional partner of CJR's, earmarking the funds to improve the accuracy in worldwide media of claims related to global health and development. Poynter's senior vice president, Kelly McBride, said Gates' money was passed on to media fact-checking sites, including Africa Check, and noted that she is absolutely confident that no bias or blind spots emerge from the work, though she acknowledged that she has not reviewed it herself. This is an incredibly important point in this story, because as we have pointed out, Africa Check is a media site that is dedicated to covering health news out of Africa, the same continent where Bill Gates himself is accused of having injured thousands of children with a polio vaccine. In fact, we've shown you video of this, and Mickey Willis covered it extensively in Plandemic 2, that activists in Africa are working hard to keep Gates out after they say their children were injured by those polio vaccines. Vaccines which you can see on video, Bill Gates pouring into the mouth of a child. Again, though he is not a doctor, though he has no medical training. Africa Check says it went on to receive an additional $1.5 million from Gates in 2017 and 2019. Our funders or supporters have no influence over the claims we fact-check and the conclusions we reach in our reports, said Noko Magado, executive director of Africa Check, in a statement to CJR. With all fact checks involving our funders, we include a disclosure note to inform the reader. Since 2000, the Gates Foundation has given NPR $17.5 million through 10 charitable grants, all of them earmarked for coverage of global health and education, specific issues on which Gates works, which means specific issues on which Gates cannot be criticized. That for all the work that he is doing, he cannot be criticized by these same media organizations who he is paying to cover those specific issues.
The community that is the most fierce, the most outspoken, the most awake is the African community. They're not playing. They've been there. They've seen it. They protest every single day, and they are warning each other like crazy because they understand that they have been used through generations as test subjects.
CJR notes that it found 16 examples of Africa Check examining media claims related to Gates, and that its body of work overwhelmingly supports or defends Bill and Melinda Gates and their foundation, which has spent billions of dollars on development efforts in Africa. And of course, these fact checkers don't actually use facts in order to defend their position or even Gates himself. And we have seen that over and over with many of the stories we've done, but also with the story of Plandemic 2. Dr. David Martin is one of the main voices in that piece. He has been called a liar by these fact checkers, a conspiracy theorist, and someone who is peddling misinformation to the masses. And yet, for his part, Dr. David Martin says he has all of the source information available from the statements he has made. The fact checkers, on the other hand, as he points out, never use source information. Listen.
And not one of the fact checkers has actually made reference to a single source documentation that we present, as you know, in great detail within the film. So nobody is contesting the facts. What they are doing is seeking public statements from individuals who are confirming opinions that were opinions built on media publications that actually have never been substantiated by anyone for any reason. So this is a very interesting opinion checking, not fact checking. There hasn't been a fact in Plandemic 2 that has been subjected to something as simple as the scientific rigor of saying, let's look at the source document, let's confirm what is said in the film, and let's make sure that what's said in the film matches the source document.
Well, I think the word source document is extremely important here because, as you said, none of these fact checks go back to any source documents. In fact, what they all do is and what they're all essentially doing is going back, as you said, to articles in the past that have been written, acting as if the authority on any subject is an article as opposed to source documentation. How frustrating is that?
So my organization has worked for over 2 decades with law enforcement, with international and domestic intelligence and criminal intelligence operations. And what is funny is we have a thing called the FBI chain of custody with respect to our data. What that means, Ben, is that we have to make sure that we can show that information that we're relying on is actually the original document or a facsimile of the original document. We have to make sure that we can show that it was obtained legally, meaning we didn't hack or crack or in any way use a technology to penetrate firewalls or do anything else. So we have a very high standard when it comes to what we call source documentation, and it happens to be a law enforcement standard for good reason, because our information has been and continues to be used for law enforcement operations. And as a result, my definition of source documentation is something that comes out of law enforcement. It doesn't come out of kind of this postmodern media echo chamber, which once again is opinion confirmation, a confirmation bias established by headlines, reinforced by headlines, rather than looking at facts. And so this is a very important topic for us to address, which is every single point specifically that I make within the entirety of Plandemic 2, every point has an actual source document, not some conjecture, not a media report, actual source documentation, including funding records, including NIH grants, including patent applications, including appeals made by patent applicants when their patents were rejected by the United States Patent Office. All of those documents are source documents.
And by the way, we did invite the Poynter Institute, USA Today, and PolitiFact. We have invited reporters from all of those organizations, or I should say fact checkers from all those organizations, to have a one-on-one debate with Dr. David Martin. We would stream it live and I would moderate it in order for them to provide their source information that calls him a liar and claims that he is engaging in misinformation. They have declined. Each one of them has said no, they're either too busy or not interested. We're not really surprised. Having said all of that, it is important to know that Children's Health Defense, the organization run by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has now filed a RICO lawsuit against Facebook and its fact checkers, claiming that they are engaged in a conspiracy and racketeering. Children's Health Defense, led by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has sued Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook Incorporated, and 3 fact checkers, Science Feedback, Poynter Institute, and PolitiFact. Facebook acknowledges it coordinates its censorship campaign with the WHO and the CDC, while earlier court decisions have upheld Facebook's right to censor its pages. CHD argues that Facebook's pervasive government collaborations makes its censorship of CHD a First Amendment violation. The government's role in Facebook's censorship goes deeper than its close coordination with CDC and WHO. The Facebook censorship began at the suggestion of powerful Democratic Congressman and Intelligence Committee Chairman Representative Adam Schiff, who in March of 2019 asked Facebook to suppress and purge internet content critical of government vaccine policies. Facebook and Schiff used the term misinformation as a euphemism for any statement, whether truthful or not, that contradicts official government pronouncements. Guys, this is such an important story. We're going to continue to follow it closely, and we have so much important information that is being censored. We want to encourage you to go check out all of that content right now at ise.media.